Over 40,000 Palestinians dead, starvation and PTSD, as well as disease ravaging a majority of the population, destroying all of the hospitals while preventing medical supplies from getting into Gaza.
When it says the intent to destroy in whole or in part, the intent must be to destroy the group as a whole.
The Akkad Museum of Culture, the Rafah Museum, which is culture as well. There's a Roman cemetery, the oldest mosque, like two of the oldest mosques in Gaza have been destroyed.
The case here being made isn't simply that civilians have died within the area. Civilian death isn't enough. Prior to October 7th, no area of Gaza was occupied by Israel.
So just to clarify on that real quick, you are kind of going against the International Court of Justice and saying that. I don't believe that, but also specifically.
What do you mean? They have. What do you mean? Like,
with all due respect, I would trust like the IPC, UNRWA, Oxfam, and their calculations over like your calculations. We're back with another debate, this time on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I want to give a quick shout out to my guest. He came in, was the utmost respectful, was flexible about getting the schedule to making it happen, and I think overall we had a really good and thoughtful, insightful discussion. So as always, let me know in the comments what you think about the positions and the ideas that were proposed, and who you think won. So I believe that Israel's actions in the last 11 months now have constituted genocide. When talking about genocide, I think it's important to understand exactly what it means, as most people have really only heard the term in passing, largely associated with the Holocaust, but a genocide doesn't have to be a Holocaust. While a Holocaust is destruction or slaughter on a mass scale, genocide is more about intent than numbers. From the Bosnian genocide of 8,000 to the Rohingya genocide of around 25,000, you can see that it's not about numbers, as both of these are relatively small in scale, but both were determined to be genocides. Genocide is a term that was coined by Raphael Lemkin and is officially defined in 5 acts, where if any of the 5 are committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group, then it's genocide. Those 5 acts being killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring physical destruction, measures intended to prevent births, or forcibly transferring children to another group, with Raphael Lemkin specifically stressing the importance of cultural destruction, as Raphael Lemkin specifically wanted to note that genocide can mostly be cultural, separate from the physical destruction, which I think is the most important part to focus in on this situation, because I think that Israel easily clears 3, if not 4, of the requirements for genocide. I mean, over 40,000 Palestinians dead, starvation and PTSD, as well as disease ravaging a majority of the population, destroying all of the hospitals while preventing medical supplies from getting into Gaza and limiting aid, where the civilian population is living on 245 calories a day, which is less than a can of beans and only 12% the daily recommended intake. But this happening alongside the clear cultural destruction of Palestinians, which, as Lemkin stresses, is the main factor of intent when you're discussing genocide, with Israel destroying over 200 historic buildings in Palestine, almost 600 schools. The Great Omari Mosque has been destroyed. The ancient port of Anthedon, cultural museums have been destroyed, which almost to a T eerily fits Lemkin's definition of cultural genocide, which is specifically prohibiting or destroying cultural institutions and cultural activities, destruction of national monuments, destroying cultural institutions and cultural or libraries, archives, museums, and galleries, which the ICC has ruled to include as direct evidence of genocide. Specifically, the ICC notes where there is physical or biological destruction, there are often simultaneous attacks on the cultural and religious property and symbols of the targeted group as well. Attacks which may legitimately be considered as evidence of intent to physically destroy the group. This includes, for example, attacks on buildings that hold cultural significance for the targeted group, which occur simultaneously with biological or physical means directed at the targeted group. The former may be evidence of specific intent to destroy the targeted group. And with this, I believe that we see it is clear that what is going on in Gaza fits the official definition of genocide and the specifications that the creator of the term meant. In the open floor portion, I'm happy to get into additional factors such as specific attacks, Israeli sexual assault and torture of Palestinian prisoners, quotes of intent from Israeli leaders. But with that, I'd like to rest my opening statement.
So when discussing genocide, I do think it's important to specify our terms. I think that there was a slight hand or maybe misunderstanding of the genocide term used in Article 2 as it relates to this case, in that when it says the intent to destroy in whole or in part, the intent must be to destroy the group as a whole. So claiming individual deaths and numbers of individual deaths. Firstly, you discussed intent and then said 40,000, which is a numbers thing rather than an intent thing. But to talk about intent to destroy a group, it means that killing individuals in that group isn't enough to meet the dollar specialis standard, and that one must be seeking to destroy the group as a whole. When it comes to the unfolding case of genocide, the prevalence of what you're discussing is cultural genocide. It is not something that I have yet considered. I don't think that it's something that's made clear in the relevant international law statutes, aside from maybe quotes from the person that you provided. But when it comes to the claims of a physical genocide, we are discussing such that from the Pentagon they see no evidence of an unfolding genocide, or that that a genocide must be well, most clearly we're discussing a case in which the Pentagon sees no unfolding genocide. When it comes to the provision of aid or the destruction of schools or healthcare facilities, there is a clear case of exception into which this is allowed in international law, under the last clause, I believe, of Article 53 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The case of the failure to provide aid, and I'm sure we're going to get into this later, is that a lot of the cases under which genocide is argued to be occurring are ones that assume occupation of Gaza, and this is something that I reject, and it certainly is not an international law. It's certainly not a given in international law. I reject the claim that Gaza is occupied. I think I'm happy to rest my time there, and we'll move on.
So there was a few things, I guess, in your opening that I kind of want to briefly address. First, genocide can be the intent to destroy a group in part. The definition of genocide in Genocide Convention is in whole or in part. Again, this is kind of what distinguishes it from Holocaust. This is kind of what distinguishes it from other war crimes, whereas it's more just about the intent. And what you brought about with cultural genocide, I'm not just specifically talking about cultural genocide on its own. In 2021, the ICC ruled that cultural destruction or like the destroying of culture in this way can be used as specific evidence of the intent to commit genocide if it's happening alongside this kind of physical destruction, which is why I brought up like and I can butcher some of these names, but like the Al Khawara Cultural Museum, the Akkad Museum of Culture, the Rafa Museum, which is culture as well. There's a Roman cemetery, the oldest mosque, like two of the oldest mosques in Gaza have been destroyed. Fortified sites, archaeological sites have all been destroyed in Gaza. This kind of cultural destruction, along with the what I would consider disproportionate killing of civilians, constitutes the evidence that the ICC lays out in their guidelines of intent when you're talking about genocide. So that's why I think it's important to bring that up. And I think that the cultural aspect happening along with the killing of civilians is core to the argument of why genocide is being committed. And then you brought up something about a clause, which we can get more into in the open floor period, because I'm not exactly sure what you meant or what clause you were citing. But I do know that in the Rome Statute, it does protect cultural property. And in the Hague Convention of 1954, it defines cultural property as property of great importance to cultural heritage of every people in the group, monuments of architecture, art or history, religious or secular, groups of building, and then properties of historic interest, which I think clearly meets the standard of historic buildings being destroyed, mosques being destroyed. But I am at 2 minutes, so I'm going to rest my time to not go over again.
Okay, so I only really have 2 points of clarification before we get into the meat of the discussion, which is to say that on the one hand, yes, it does refer to in part of the group, the intent to destroy in whole or in part, and on the other hand, that point kind of notwithstanding, because the intent to destroy a group is still relevant there. It's necessary that it's not just that you can prove that individuals within the group have been destroyed, that individuals have been destroyed, individuals within the group have been killed, but that individuals in the group have been killed with the intent to destroy the group, whether that be in whole or in part. The case here being made isn't simply that civilians have died within the area. Civilian death isn't enough. Even in just civilian death goes none of the way to proving a genocide. It's all on the intent portion, which was what you said in the original statement, not on the actual effect. You can, in theory, commit a genocide without ever killing a single person, um, at least in principle. The other thing that I wanted to clarify was regarding the clause that I mentioned. What it's specifying in the Fourth Geneva Convention, it's the final clause, I believe, of Article 53, is that what what you're allowed to destroy for the purposes of military activity. So what it says is these hospitals, schools, and historical sites, what you would be describing as hospital schools and areas of important cultural significance, these can't be destroyed, and then it gives the final clause, except in cases of absolute military necessity. Um, and I don't know many of the cases that you're talking about, so I can't argue in specifics. But what I do know is that there is there is good evidence in cases that I can bring up of the destruction of cultural sites or military sites, what would be by international law military sites, but that have cultural significance, and that would meet the bar for invoking also in infrastructure. That would meet the bar of invoking this clause in Article 53, at least by a proper application of the reasonable what would you say, a reasonable officer test?
Okay, so I kind of want to start with, again, I just want to drill in because I think that one of the biggest disagreements that we had from my opening and yours was on the intent to destroy, right? It seems to me like you think that the intent to destroy has to be in whole, when I think that in part is important there. And if you look at other cases of genocides, you can see that ones have been legally prosecuted as genocide without destroying even a majority of the group, let alone all of the group. Like,
just to clarify, I don't think that the intent to destroy has to be in whole, but I do think it has to be off the group. That was the bit that I was disagreeing. So sorry to interrupt, but I don't think that I think that you can attempt to destroy a group in part, and that would be a genocide. But
okay.
it has to be the intent to destroy the group. It can't be the intent to destroy or kill individuals within the group, however many individuals you're attempting to kill. Like this is the difference between genocide and war crime.
Yeah, no, and I do completely agree with you there. And I just, okay, so then I guess my question would be kind of how do you think, so your question isn't, is it that they're not trying to destroy the group because of the number that are killed, or is it like what is the problem you have with my claim that they are trying to destroy the group in part?
Oh, because it seemed that your argument was conflating the two cases. On the one hand, that they're trying to destroy the group in part, and two, that they've destroyed many individuals within the group. They killed many individuals within the group, and
Yeah.
that's true. We can't. We're really not in a position to determine the proportion of which are civilian versus military. Uh, but what we do know is that there have been many people that have died. That provides no direct evidence for the claim of genocide.
Well,
Which is
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off if I did, but
no, it's fine. I cut you off with it.
it kind of does in a way, because again, there's the five acts that are laid out in genocide. And I do think that most of the destruction of the group has been cultural. I'm willing to get like into more of the specifics with that, kind of some of the things I laid out. But it's when you mix physical destruction, so like killing members of the group, that's one of the acts of genocide. When you mix that with the destruction of like the cultural relevance of the group, I think that's for me what clearly constitutes genocide. When you're erasing their schools, when you're destroying their hospitals, when you're destroying their cultural sites. Over 200 historic buildings have been destroyed. I think it's like specifically for cultural damage, it's like millions of dollars in damage that has been done in Gaza, specifically to cultural sites. So when you mix that with also 2% of the population has been killed in 10 months or 11 months now, then I think you can see where there is clear intent there.
Well, I don't think that you get to make the case in the opening that it's an intent thing, and now make the case that numbers are part of the equation. So I agree with the first iteration of you, and not the second. If that makes sense. In that, I think that we can clarify this on intent. In that, genocide is literally defined as the intent to destroy. It's not defined as this is why I say that it's possible in theory to commit
Well,
genocide without
so
anyone actually having to die. But when it comes to 2% of the population, we are not to know if traditionally, and I can give you like cases where I know that the massive numbers have been faked because I can read Arabic, and We don't know the proportion of the deaths are civilian versus military. So if we say that going into the war, we knew that something like 1.7% of the population were Hamas fighters, the most reasonable estimates had it between 25 and 30,000 fighters. And we know that the numbers of men killed run disproportionately, at least to the number of women and children killed. Then we can say that since the UN revision, then we can say that this we can park the number of people, and even if we couldn't park the number of people when it comes to not knowing who's being killed, we could at least park the number of people when it comes to an analysis of the claim of genocide, which is an intent-based claim.
So, okay, so I to be clear, I do mostly agree with you. I think maybe you're misunderstanding what I was saying. And just to give kind of like the clarifying statement, it's intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. And then there's also 5 acts that have to be met, or well, one of them has to be met along with the intent. So I bring up the cultural destruction as the intent, and then I bring up the number that's been killed kind of as to show they've reached the threshold for the first claim. The first act that has to be met in genocide is killing members of the group. So they've killed members of the group. They've specifically killed members of the group. And then I think the intent to destroy the group is there because with destroying 2% of the population, they've also destroyed a lot of their cultural relevance. I don't know how much you want to like circle on this point, if you had something else you wanted to say on it, but then I did kind of want to get into also the health ministry's numbers, because
the only we just to clarify this first, the only what I'm actually arguing isn't the claim. We can discuss the claim as well, but I don't think that the desire for cultural destruction, in combination with the death of 40,000 people, if we take 40,000 to be the number, is in and of itself good enough evidence to meet the bar for genocide. Because I don't think the evidence could be provided for genocide in the number of people dead.
No, so okay, so the evidence is the cultural destruction. The ICC in 2021 specifically came out with guidelines of intent, like how through intent, what intent can be used as evidence that genocide is happening. And I said in my opening, hold on, I can.
Well then, why do you bring up the 40,000?
Oh, because you have to have the intent, and then you also have to meet the 5 acts, where one of those 5 acts is killing members of the group. So they've killed members of the group, they've killed 40,000, and then I believe that you can prove intent as evidence of that being a genocide through the fact that culturally they've destroyed Palestinians as well.
Wait, so you think that you can draw a straight line from the deaths of the 40,000 people to the desire to culturally destroy Palestine?
I
Like you think
think I think destroying 2% of the population in coordinates with the cultural destruction constitutes what a genocide is. I don't
Oh
think,
no,
like,
because
I'm
you'd
not
have to
saying
prove
the, I'm sorry, what were you saying?
you'd have to prove the desire to destroy the group culturally was responsible for the death of 40,000. That's what you'd have to.
No, like, no, I'm not saying like the act of, like how I said in my opening, the act of genocide can be mostly cultural, but then you have to apply it with the 5 things that were listed as these 5 acts also have to happen. But then as Raphael Lemkin states, as the ICC has updated their guidelines to include that the act of genocide can be mostly cultural. In my opinion, I think that most of the evidence that the genocide is happening is cultural. That's what I would weigh my argument on. But then I also think clearly Israel has passed at least 3 of the 5 acts. They've killed members of the group. There's 40,000 dead. They've caused serious bodily or mental harm. Most of the majority of the Palestinians have PTSD now. The numbers have went up since before.
But I think you're reading the 5 like cases in isolation of the definition of genocide. So it might seem like I'm nitpicking to anyone who's listening to this, and possibly I am, but we're talking about genocide as a special case. We're not talking about war crimes in general, which we can have a more interesting discussion about. But when it comes to genocide, or perhaps we can have a more interesting discussion about, when it comes to genocide in particular, what we're saying is that these actions within these 5 categories, killing members of the group, etc., are running for the purpose of destroying the group in whole or in part. And destroying the group is the motive, and the means for fulfilling the motive is one of these five conditions. And what you're proving is that one of the 5 conditions in that, there have been people in Gaza that have been killed, and they are members of the group Palestinians, and that there is some degree of cultural destruction. Those are your 2 claims. but you need to link them. You need to link the motive to the crime in some sense.
Yeah, yeah. So to me, the motive is the destruction of the group. I feel like we're just maybe having like a some semantically kind of
Okay, okay.
misunderstanding here. I do think that the motive is the destruction of the group. I think that it can be proved through the fact that they've culturally erased like a lot of like the historic sites, a lot of the cultural sites in Gaza. They've done that while also killing 2% of the population, while also eliciting serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. There's PTSD running rabbit through Gaza. There's, I know scabies is, polio. I think a lot of kids are threatened with polio. I read a report. It's somewhere in six figures, somewhere in the 100,000s, deliberately inflicting groups upon the group calculated to bring the physical destruction, destroying hospitals, refusing aid to come in. I think that these barriers are being met along with cultural destruction that shows that their intent with their actions with these bombings isn't just, hey, we need to rid of Hamas, but the intent is we want to culturally eradicate Palestinians to the best of our ability, which in my opinion, I don't think that anyone could get away with destroying a group in whole. So I think that Israel is
Well,
trying to, in part, like to the best of their abilities, destroy the cultural application of
well,
Palestinian.
then I think we need to get into hospitals and schools and aid and civilian death, um, because you had a problem with me saying that Hamas numbers were unreliable.
Yeah, yeah, and we're
Um,
actually we actually hit our first 10 minutes, so we could go ahead and just start like
okay,
wrapping
well,
up that.
I think that that segues quite well in the whole on the whole. Um, so I would like to I'd like to see, well, why do you think Hamas numbers are reliable, particularly in light of, for example, the health ministry in Gaza admitting flaws in its casualty data?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start a timer and we can get into it. So let me I have this written here. So there's a couple reasons specifically. They use numbers from hospitals and journalists in the area, as well as the first responders. They're not linked to Hamas in the way of the resistance group, but that Hamas is also like the government in Gaza. So you have to think like the people who pick up the trash in Gaza are technically Hamas. That doesn't mean they're picking up arms and doing terrorism. But if you look at, there's been multiple investigations in this specific instance of these numbers. John Hopkins University, the World Health Organization, the London School of Hygiene, they've all investigated the numbers. They found them to be consistent. They're consistent with UNRWA and their reports on the death. Human Rights Watch has also investigated and confirmed. And then what I think is maybe the most damning evidence is Air Wars, which is a British organization at random in the, I think it was 2 months after the conflict started, took 3,000 of this at that point there were 7,000 deaths that Hamas, the health ministry had reported. They took 3,000 of them, so roughly half of the names that were reported, and they cross-referenced those names with social media accounts, with independent media, with reports, and they found that they could confirm practically all the names. It was over 90%. I don't remember the exact percent. And then professors also analyzed that list and found that the records were almost completely accurate as well. So I think there's
Because
plenty of
the UN at a time when there was the claim of about 34,000 deaths could only confirm 24,000 of the names. Like it wasn't like it that was the UN revision when they said that when they seemingly half the number of women and children were that were like killed. They took the numbers and they saw who they could verify by ID, and then they verified them by ID, and they can only verify something like 2/3 of the people who've been killed. I
well,
mean,
yeah.
it's also the case that I can give you like examples of people probably off the top of my head if I thought about it for long enough that were people where they've had their deaths registered, and then their names have appeared to get like their ages appear to have decreased as the months after they die have elapsed. I don't think that when I say Hamas run, also I kind of agree with you. Hamas is both a military force, Al Qassam, and they're a governing body who picks up trash, or as the case may be in Gaza, don't pick up trash. Um, and they are therefore the government as well as being military. But when it or government as well as being the military stroke informal guerrilla force. But I don't think that when you have the particularly when it comes to civilian data, which is really what we're arguing about here, when you have the UN halving their women and children death rate, you have reports from data scientists saying that Gaza fatality numbers have become completely unreliable. When the BBC is admitting their inaccurate reporting of Gaza civilian deaths, I really don't think that we can determine the extent to which these are military versus civilian casualties. And even I don't think it's possible to verify the 40,000 number that you gave at the start.
Yeah, so my problem with that would be, again, pretty much every investigation into the numbers has came back that they're pretty consistent. The World Health Organization has investigated the numbers, London School of Hygiene, Johns Hopkins University. It's been consistent with UNRWA reports. My question for you, because I know you brought up the numbers being revised, so just like a kind of consistency question, right? Do you think that the numbers that were reported on Israel's side of casualties on October the 7th, would you say that those were accurate?
On October the 7th, they reported something like 1,500, and it turned out that they revised it down to about 1,200, so that 1,200 was probably the right number of casualties for October 7th. What happened on October 7th was that they found people in multiple parts charred and then assumed that their bodies were separate people, and it turned out that they were in many cases the same people. So that it was probably about 1,200 people, and about a third of
And yeah,
those were military, and about two-thirds of those were civilian.
and I agree. I mean, I'm not disputing that or anything, but I'm just saying for the fact that like the same can be said for Hamas. A lot of the people were unidentifiable. There's people who were found without identification. So they've had a lot of the same problems. So I just, for me, it's like if we're going
What do
beyond
you mean?
question, what part exactly were you asking?
Is Israel at no point claimed to release definitive data until the final calculation, the revised number was given? So that, I mean, they're still in some sense they're still in some sense revising the data because they attribute October 7th deaths. For example, if I have PTSD from October 7th and I commit suicide 6 months later, is called an October 7th death in Israel. So the number of people that died actually on October 7th is about 1,225. But when it at no point before the finalization of the number did Israel claim to give definitive numbers. Hamas, for example, when it came to al-Ahli, claimed to be giving an absolute number, and then it was revised down by the night, and then it was that number was cast into significant skepticism by the European Parliament after that. It's what's happening isn't here like gradual realization of the number of people that are dying, but rather claims that seem to be made about the numbers of people dying but then proven wrong and then have to be revised down. That's what it looks like from the outside.
Yeah, well, excuse me. A lot of the revisions come from a lot of the same problems that you're mentioning with Israel, where the bodies were unidentifiable, where they like whether it be from lack of identification, from the damage done to the body, they're digging bodies out of the rubble still. So like I do understand that the numbers aren't concrete, but historically, US state departments have required on the Gaza Health Ministry for its numbers and found it to be accurate. US intelligence has reported the confidence that they are historically accurate in reporting their numbers in most conflicts. When the Gaza Health Ministry reports a number or like a death toll, and then outside investigation comes in, like the numbers typically are accurate. Most investigations into the number have came back as accurate. So I do
Okay,
understand
because
that.
I don't believe that that's how the revisions are occurring. Like I don't believe that they're occurring in the same way that they were occurring after October 7th. Because after October 7th, you had an area that the Israeli government controlled, and the Israeli government put out an initial estimate of about 1,500, and then they revised down their own estimate based on their own counting. And what's not happening here is Hamas revising down their own estimates based on new data. What's happening is the UN trying to confirm, to give this example, the UN trying to confirm the number of people dying and then revising the numbers down by 10,000, despite not being particularly present in the area. What's happening is just that it's not like Hamas give an estimation and then it turns out that there are some people who are under the rubble, which, by the way, assuming that was the case, what you'd expect is that the estimations would be low and then they'd find more people and then it would increase the number of people that were dying. But what's happening instead is that the health ministry in Gaza is giving a number and then it's trying to be verified by an external source like the UN, and then the UN is revising down, because they can't confirm the number of people that are being given out, that are being what would you say, like given as dead by the health
Okay,
ministry
so
in Gaza.
I think I see where the disconnect here is. To be clear, the Gaza Health Ministry releases a number which is about, I think it's 29,000 30,000 that they have of identifiable bodies, and then they have
Yes, it was because they are post the UN revising their numbers down.
yeah, well, but
Um,
they release reports also like where the 40,000 number comes from with unidentifiable bodies, but the UNRWA and the UN they're reporting
it also
only
includes
on
missing people. It also includes missing people. But the point is
yeah.
that it happened retroactively. So that
Well, yeah, that's
it
how
was like,
revisions would happen. They would always
no, no. I mean, it was like retroactively continuous. So it wasn't that Hamas revived their own numbers. It was that the UN said we can only verify these numbers, and then the Gaza Health Ministry admitted that there were flaws in their casualty numbers. Like it happened that way around. It didn't happen that the health ministry was willing to say these aren't our absolute numbers. They were giving out a number in the 30,000s for verifiable dead until I think it was April. I can't remember, and then they revised it down based on the UN saying that they could only confirm 29,000 or 24 at the time.
So I don't know how accurate of a representation it is. I don't care really to go in circles too much about it. To my knowledge, what's
Okay.
always happened is that they've released identifiable deaths and then they've released unidentifiable deaths, and the identifiable deaths have always been in line with UNRWA reports and others. My question for you, I guess, to kind of move it forward a little bit, because we are coming up on 9 minutes in this section, but to kind of move it forward a little bit, why do you think that like the Air Wars report, when they investigated 3,000 of the 7,000 names, came back over 90% accurate? Why do you think like investigations like Johns Hopkins University, the World Health Organization, why do you think all these investigations have found the numbers to be relatively accurate if you don't think that they're accurate?
Well, one of the reasons is because I think it's much easier to provide accurate data at the beginning of a war. So that I kind of agree with you to a certain extent that what's going to be going on in many cases is that the presence of people verifying death figures that aren't Hamas, like third parties like the UN, the International Red Cross, is going to be higher at the beginning of the war than it will be now. So it's much easier to verify um, the number of people that are dying. My question to you would be, if you believe that the reports of the data that the health ministry are giving are accurate, then what do you do with their admission that their data on civilian deaths was inaccurate? The UN seemingly halving the number of women and children that were suggested to have been killed. BBC admitting that its reporting of civilian deaths in Gaza was wrong. Reports that the fatality data in Gaza has become completely unreliable, or data scientists saying that in November, like taking 2 weeks out in November and saying that the talking about statistical impossibility of the death figures of those 2 weeks in November, or things like that. At this point, it just seems like trading reports.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like that's largely kind of what it boils down to most of the time. I do like quick, just which I'll answer your question, but quick to clarify, like the investigations that I listed, like the World Health Organization, Johns Hopkins University, a lot of these came later on in the war, like have happened this year. Do you still think that even though they've happened later on, that they're inaccurate? And then I can go ahead and answer your question.
The answer is I don't know. I'd have to read them. I'm not I'm not going to create an ad hoc argument because that's how you get dismantled in the play. But um, it seems that there will be some reports that are maybe earlier on, maybe in some cases not, that are confirming the numbers are vaguely accurate. To be fair, I'm less interested in the number or the 2% figure because maybe 90% of the buildings in Gaza have been at least partially destroyed. So that 2% of the population dying under those circumstances wouldn't be unexpected. The question more for me is proportions of deaths that are civilians or women and children um, being inflated versus not inflated. That would be more of a question for me than the number of people dying. But sorry, you were going to answer my question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, also just I guess to add on that too, the like even with UN reports and things like that, I think it's 70%, 65%, somewhere around 70 are women and children. But to answer your question, I would
The,
agree.
the, the revision in April suggested that 52% were men.
Last I heard was when it was revised to 29,000, or there were 29,000 that were identifiable, that it was 15 or 16,000, I think, that were women and children. But
Okay, I know that at the point at which they revised it to 24,000, it was just under 10,000 that they were saying were women. Hang on, at the point at which they revised it to 24,000, it was 48% women and children, 52% men.
okay,
I've
so
got the
and then
exact numbers.
to answer your question, because I don't mean to like, derail or skirt away from it or
Mm-hmm.
anything. I would agree with you that the later war goes on, that reporting will be less accurate, especially with how the Gaza Health Ministry records its numbers from hospitals and journalists. When Israel is bombing hospitals and killing journalists, obviously it's going to be a lot harder to get accurate numbers. For me, what I would rely on is historically, even when Israel is imposing these conditions and other conflicts with Gaza, historically the numbers come back as roughly accurate. I mean, with every count, there's going to be both sides release their numbers, they're revised down a bit, and then they come to an agreement. But historically, Gaza Health Ministry has always been relatively accurate. I think that, along
But
with
that's I don't think you've. The point is that you have reports that suggest they're accurate, and I have reports that suggest they're not. So your question was what I do with your reports, and my question was what you do with mine. I
yeah, so
think saying that the
I'm
Gaza
trying.
Health Ministry, I think saying that the Gaza Health Ministry has been historically accurate is to kind of miss the point because there has never been this scale. There hasn't been this scale of a war in Gaza since 2005, since before the unilateral Israeli pullout from the Western Negev.
Sure. And I mean, like, so I could give that maybe they're like a little less accurate, but like, I mean, before October 7th, the deadliest year in Gaza was 2021. The deadliest year after that was 2022. So I think being able to go through still bombing, still killings. I mean, in 2018, there was the March of Return, these kinds of things where they're still able to give roughly accurate data throughout history. And then also, what I would lean on in this specific situation would be the outside investigations throughout the dates of this genocide that have also confirmed it. I would think that calling it inflating, I think would be at least that I wouldn't concede to because I think it's would be a bit disingenuous. But I do think maybe like if you want to say they're less accurate now than they are at the beginning, I would say sure, as would anyone who's getting bombed. But historically, even when these numbers are happening, even in 2005, even in all these times when numbers are released from the Palestinian side, historically they are roughly accurate. We
Yeah,
are
but
over 10 minutes. We
they're not.
can
Okay, I
I was
just
just gonna
don't
say
think
we are
they're.
over 10
I
minutes,
just
but
don't.
we can keep going if you wanted, or we could move on. So it's
Okay, well, I guess the only thing I'd say is that I don't think that historical parallels like the Great March of Return are equivalent in scale or in scope to what's going on now. So you would expect that the error bars here be much, much, much higher. But the other thing I'd like to get on, you talked about the shipment of aid, and this is something that interests me particularly because I don't think it's spoken of very often. The burden of Israel to provide aid, for instance, doesn't exist. It's not. It exists in the case of an occupied territory, but prior to October 7th, no area of Gaza was occupied by Israel. Um, and
so
I,
just to clarify on that real quick, you are kind of going against the International Court of Justice in saying that because they did rule that the annexation of land, what Israel has been doing with Gaza, has constituted not only occupation but apartheid since 1967. So I mean,
no, Israel has not annexed any land in Gaza since 2005.
yeah, well, when they pulled out, the ICJ looked into this and the fact that they still the way that Israel still expressed authority over the land. They still had registries of the people. They still decided what came in and out. Like Gaza didn't have control of their ports, these kinds of things. The ICJ has ruled that that still constitutes occupation.
When was it ruled that Gaza is still occupied? The standard for
This
occupation
came
is
out
the effective.
just recently. Like it was just a couple months ago, maybe even less. Like it was historic because
I can you tell me can you just tell me the case because I am interested in this. International law is non-exhaustive, so it doesn't have to be that Gaza is either occupied or not. The standard for occupation is the effective control test,
So it
which
came out
lays out.
around July 19th. The ICJ released an opinion that declared Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories unlawful, and that it constituted racial segregation and apartheid.
Yeah,
Um,
but does it say that this is Gaza?
Palestinian, yeah, well, Gaza is a
Yeah, no.
Palestinian territory.
Palestinian territories are like Area A and Area B and possibly Golan. It doesn't that doesn't specify that it's
Yeah,
Gaza.
so the
Like
ICJ opinion comes at a time when Israel has been flagrantly flouting international humanitarian law on a cataclysmic scale for the past 9 months, carrying out. Oh, well, this is about the attack.
but
Uh,
this the question when it comes to occupation is does it meet the standard for occupation, which is either called the occupation test or the effective control test, depending on which source you go by. And it's that one of them requires one of the points requires the actual presence of the military force of the occupying territory. Like
So
it's
they specifically say that Israel must withdraw its forces from all parts of the occupied territories, including the Gaza Strip, and removing all settlers from the West Bank. Like the ICJ says that specifically in their ruling.
okay. I still I'd like to see their justification as to why Gaza is occupied. I don't think Gaza is occupied
Yeah, I mean, I don't
because
have I don't like, it would probably take the whole 10 minutes to surf through the report on its own. I can send
no,
you
no. But
after, but
we,
like,
we 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 don't have to do the report. Surely we can discuss it. There is a standard for occupation that we can discuss what the Gaza means.
sure. I mean, well, I would rely on international law, so I just feel like it would kind of be like butting
No, no,
heads.
but I am also relying on international law. I'm relying on the standard of occupation rather than international authority. We can go through which international authorities deem Gaza to be occupied and which don't. Um, the ICJ itself said that the occupation in Democratic Republic of Congo versus Uganda said that occupation requires the substitution of the local government. This is clearly a standard that wasn't met in Gaza. And it sounds like the report that you're bringing up is saying that, firstly, it's July. So it's saying that Israel must withdraw from the areas of Gaza it currently occupies. Well, it does occupy areas of Gaza at the moment because its military is in Gaza. It didn't occupy areas of Gaza
No, no, no,
pre
no, no, no,
October
no.
7th.
This ruling was that it ruled back from 1967 to now. And I understand that they withdrew their troops, but it's the control that they still expressed over Gaza that made it considered an occupation. The fact that Gaza didn't have its own access or control over its ports of entry, its imports and exports. The Israel still controlled who could come in and who could come out. They had the registry for, like, I don't know if it's like citizenship, maybe the wrong word, but they had like the registry of everyone who was in Gaza. And these kind of things made them like an acting authority over Gaza, despite the fact that they withdrew their troops. And so, like, for me, I would rely on the fact that the ICJ took all this into account, looked over it, and ruled that it is a legal occupation.
Well, the ICJ, though, also determined in DRC versus Uganda, like I said, that occupation requires the substitution of the local government, which is not something that occurred. I can read you the quote from the judgment if you're interested. I mean, the ICJ also laid out in what was it? It was prosecutor versus I don't know. It was the Serbia case. It was the Yugoslavian case. And they laid out standards to act as guidelines for assistance in the decision as to whether a territory is occupied, and Gaza doesn't meet many of them. What we're talking about here is a, a case in international law which is non-exhaustive, i.e., I don't have to prove that Gaza is like a sovereign territory. What you're suggesting is that if, for example, Gaza's borders are controlled by Israel, that is part of evidence that it's occupied. No, it's just part of evidence that it's non-sovereign.
Well, no,
And
that
non-sovereign.
along with the authority that they impose over those who are in Gaza, they act as if they are an acting government. They control who can go in and out. They can control what will go in and out. They control like the rules and the rights of the people in there. That's why it was also constituted as apartheid, because it was seen that Israel has control of the rules of the people in Gaza, and they're subjecting them based on their ethnic group to what would be second-class citizenship.
Well, they're not citizens of Israel, so the only definition that we have in international law for apartheid is the only sort of case study that we have in apartheid in international law is in South Africa, and what we can therefore assume that it refers to is cases of different rights for the same citizen. What we're talking about in Israel is different rights for different citizens.
Well, it's different rights for a group of people that you have control over based on their ethnic origin and
No,
or
it's not based on their ethnic origin.
I'm sorry, what?
It's not based on their ethnic origin. Israeli Arabs have exactly the same ethnic origin as Gaza Palestinians,
How
and the
many
Israeli
how many
Arabs have.
Arab how many Israeli Arabs are on their government? I don't believe that, but also specifically
What do
in
you mean? They have. What do you mean? Like what would it be? 10. Um, there are 10 Israeli Arabs in the Knesset.
yeah, but
When we
specifically
and
when we're
and
talking
to
about
clarify, when we're talking about apartheid, we're talking about legal rights regime. We're not talking about representation. If you want to talk about cases in which there are, for example, quotas for Israeli Arabs into universities, we can do that if you want. But when we're talking about apartheid, we're talking about two groups of citizens with differential rights.
yeah, well, Israel imposes control over Gaza, and then because of people of ethnic origin in Gaza who are different than Israelis have less rights than those in Israel. Like there's plenty of things they can't do. I mean, Palestinians can't even they can't control their imports and exports in situations. I do feel like we're kind of getting aside from the point of genocide here because I don't know how much like
Well,
occupation
because
apartheid really play in.
part of your evidence for your claim of genocide was, for example, that there are Israeli lack of provision of things like medical supplies or food,
Not lack of provision.
and
Sorry, not lack of provision, but
or lack of
specifically,
allowing
yeah, the
lack of
blockade of
allowing
allowing it
provision.
in.
Well, there
Which is
was
imposing, I think, clearly
did,
meets the standard of imposing conditions deliberately or conditions on the group deliberately to calculate it to bring physical destruction in part. I would say that withholding medical
I don't know,
supplies
maybe.
that are needed, like pain medicine, anesthesia, withholding food to the point that the
Well,
civilians are
the
subjected
Israeli
to.
government has just arranged with pretty much like bilaterally with aid organizations corridors and times of day by which they can import polio vaccines for children in Gaza. Like when we're talking about food, for instance, um, reports that I read suggest that over 3,000 calories a day have gotten into Gaza per person since the beginning of the war on
Yeah,
average.
that's
Um,
absolutely not true. Palestinians are living on 245 calories. This is from
no,
Oxford.
this is
This is
hang
from
on, hang on, hang on,
Oxfam.
hang on, hang on. We're talking. Well, for one, we're talking about different reports. For two, you're talking about distribution, and I'm talking about supply.
Yes, I'm talking about what Israel is allowing, like the
No,
amount
you're
that's
not.
being
No,
allowed
you're
in
not.
for each civilian to be able to have is 245 calories a day, which is 12% the recommended intake in the safe zones that
Okay,
they're pushing. And
we can do these numbers live if you're interested. If you just look at the number of trucks that are into Gaza per day, and then you assume, because we have this data available to us, that 70% of the weight of the goods in the trucks will be food, then we can look at how much food is going into Gaza per day, and then we can divide it by the number of citizens in the Gaza Strip. What comes out is that the weight of the food going in per citizen in Gaza, man, woman, or child, is something like 6.26 pounds, and the average American, who is fatter than the global average, so sorry, eats something like 3 to 5 pounds of food a day.
yeah, so I don't know. This Oxfam report absolutely disagrees with what you're saying. But then on top of that, also in the safe zones that they're pushing Palestinians to, there's one toilet for every 4,000 people who are in those safe zones. I think that these are also conditions that obviously are going to bring apart physical destruction. That on top of, again, you're not letting basic medical supplies in, you're not letting anesthesia in for operations. There's people dying from infections. I've spoken to doctors who have been on the ground in Gaza. We spoke about it briefly before we started. And they're saying that people are dying from wounds that are otherwise curable because of the lack of
Yeah, I'm not
supplies
suggesting that
that
these
Israel is
conditions.
being let in.
Well, I'm not suggesting. Well, that's the bit that we're disagreeing. I'm not suggesting that conditions in Gaza are anything like, what would you say, like good conditions. War is horrible, and it has the effect of making conditions, particularly in very densely populated areas, very poor for the people who are living there. But when we're talking about the provision of medical supplies, for example, we know that medical supplies constitute something like 30% of the amount of aid in weight that are going into Gaza. So we can say that there is something approaching £2 in weight of medical supplies, whatever that
Well,
takes up.
and I want to
In,
clarify. I want to clarify on the point of food. Analysis from IPC, UNRWA, and Oxfam found that absolute minimum for 2,100 calories a day per civilian in Gaza would need to have a minimum of 221 trucks of food every single day. And currently, only 105 trucks of food are entering Gaza daily. So
so
then it's
we can
about half of what is needed.
we can assume. Well, firstly, you'd have to prove the like if you have Hamas firing rockets at Kerem Shalom, then you can say that on at least in part, it's not Israel's responsibility for a failing of the provision of trucks, if that's what we're discussing. But I don't even think that's provable. When it comes, we can look at truck data going in,
Well,
and then
trucks are being
we can
specifically turned around.
hang on. No. Just we can say we can look at the number of trucks going in per day. Would you? I'll ask first. Would you assume that the balance of food that is being sent into Gaza of what's going in would be roughly the right balance to sustain somebody? There's an interest in the food going into Gaza being like enough food, like the right food as well as enough to sustain people. Would you agree with that?
If we're talking about what's being sent or what's being let in.
No, we're talking about what's being let in. It would be not like it would be the right balance of food, even if in the wrong quantity.
I would wholly disagree. No, because I mean,
So,
right
so
here, the reports show.
you think aid organizations are deliberately sending in the wrong balance of food?
No, I think they're sending the right amount of food. That's why I asked if we're talking about what's being sent or what's being let in. But trucks are being turned around for as little, like there's a report that a truck was turned around with sleeping bags in it because the sleeping bags were green, and green is the color of military. So Israel turned around the trucks of those aid. The trucks are being sent. A lot of the humanitarian aid is being sent, and Israel are turning these trucks around. Like I just read from the report from the IBC, from
Yeah,
UNRWA, from
but
Oxfam,
the question is,
221
but
trucks
that's
being used a
irrelevant to my
day.
question. As politely, that's not relevant to what I asked. Do you think it's likely that the trucks are going to be such that they're organized that so that those let in have the wrong balance of food? Like
So then you
you
are talking
believe,
about what's being sent.
yeah, yeah, because
I would
I think
agree
in
that what's
each
being
in each
sent. Sorry, go ahead.
I think in each truck there's likely to be the right balance of food, even if
I
it's in the wrong quantity.
I would
What would
agree.
what would Okay, so we agree, and that those trucks let in will have a good balance of food in the wrong quantity.
So
That's your argument.
I really want to clarify here. I would agree that what's being sent has the right balance of food. Where we disagree, it seems, is that what's being let in is enough to sustain or
No, no, no,
constitute.
no, 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 no. I'm not. We'll get to that later. I'm not saying yet that what's being let in is a high enough quantity. I'm just saying that what's being let in would be the right balance if in the wrong quantity.
Yeah, like per truck, you mean like in one truck there would
Yeah,
be.
per truck it would be in the right it would be in the right balance of food, like in terms of health of the food, even if the food was the wrong quantity to sustain the number of people living in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. My only contention would be that roughly half the amount of trucks that need to be let in are being let in.
Yeah, so if that's the case, then what we can do is we can look at the number of trucks, we can look at the weight of each truck, we can work out the weight from an FP article that was released a while ago. Sorry, FT article that was released a while ago, talking about the weight of the like 14,000 tons of food and medical aid being in 540 trucks. So we can just divide the number of trucks by the weight. Sorry, divide the weight by the number of trucks, find out how much weight is in each truck, and then we can say we know that 70% of that weight is food supplies. So then we can say how much weight of food is getting in per day, and we can compare it to the average American diet. That's my suggestion for how we determine how much food's going in. We're not it's like the least biased way of doing it. And then we can talk about also how much medical supplies are going in. And then we can use the UNRWA figures rather than the Israeli ones if that's preferable.
So, I mean, I don't see why that would be necessary when there's a report right here basing off kind of what you're saying, the amount of calories that would be in these trucks. They talk specifically about mixed items trucks, about how some of these trucks have food and have medical supplies. They take that into consideration, and they're saying based off that data, they would need 221 trucks a day. Only, however,
I did the calculations, and currently there are 6.26 pounds of food being let into Gaza or being like allowed being getting into Gaza per day, um, and the average American diet is 3 to 5 pounds. So I don't like I trust that distribution in Gaza is terrible, and that there is some Israeli responsibility for distribution in areas that they control, of course.
so I guess,
What I
and politely,
what
again, respectfully, like with all due respect, I would trust like the IPC, UNRWA, Oxfam, and their calculations over like your calculations.
Yeah, but when we're talking about Gaza in famine in Gaza, which is presumably what's being discussed here, we are talking about mixed reports. Like it's very much not clear that there is a famine in Gaza. What happens seems to happen, at least according to Relief Web, is that there
There's
is a permanent risk. Is that there is a permanent risk of famine in Gaza, but there is never exactly famine. If you're interested, I can send you a link to
No, I
that.
agree with you that there hasn't been a concrete report that came out talking about famine, but there has been multiple reports that came out and have talked about starvation and how starvation is running rampant in Gaza. And that is because of data like this. I mean, you can look at multiple different reports. Some of these are from March, some of these are from February, some of these are from July. That comes out in
Well,
different.
we know that there are individual cases of starvation. What seems to happen
It's
is
one in
that
three, 1 in 3, roughly. I mean,
what
obviously, it's not going to be one for every three, but roughly the estimates are 1 in every 3 people in Gaza are suffering from starvation and food insecurity.
You mean malnutrition, surely, not starvation.
Malnutrition for sure. Yeah, I'm almost positive
No,
it's.
no, but one in three suffering from starvation is just too high. There are one in three Gazans. Maybe what that's saying is that there are one in three Gazans living in North Gaza at the moment. So that therefore there are like that's the area that have the highest risk of starvation. But what we're talking about when it comes to starvation are like very low numbers of tens of people that have died of starvation in Gaza. We are not talking about a large number of people. We're talking about a risk in a war zone of a large number of famine of like a famine occurring, and we are not talking about a large numbers of individual cases of starvation.
So when here we're talking about the different phases of famine, starvation, and these kinds of things, with 70%, according to the IPC, 70%, around 210,000 people are phase five, which is catastrophic levels of like starvation,
What
lack
what
of
does what if what does this mean?
malnutrition. Huh?
Well, because we know, for example, that the total number of aid into Gaza, at, at this point, is now approaching 1 million tons since the start of the war. We know that 78% of whatever, I think I said 70 before, but it's like 78% of that aid is food. So we can just do like 970,000 tons times by time. Like I don't know why you're refusing the simple math, and instead citing to authorities that I can't verify live.
I mean, do you have like any evidence of like UNRWA or IPC or Oxfam being like non-credible? Like Oxfam is like a widely regarded institution. It's not like I'm just citing random numbers. I'm citing people who have looked into
No, but
exactly what I'm talking about.
you're deliberately eschewing the ability to do simple maths in favor of citing
Well,
sources that can't be verified.
wouldn't that just be me? I'm
What
taking,
I'm saying is if you have an argument in favor of the idea that there's severe lack of provision of food, then make the argument. I don't need uh, a report from an
reports that
institution of your.
confirm.
I no, I don't need a report from an institution of your choice in order to verify that. We can do a simple calculation.
Well, it's not an
If you're
institution of my choice. It's Oxfam and UNRWA. I mean, these aren't like I'm just picking random articles. These are like some of the most credible international institutions in the world. And then also, I what I think you might be doing here, I can't confirm because just like you're trying to say to me, I can't just confirm offhand any of the numbers you're saying. I think that you're talking about maybe aid that's being sent. The problem is a lot of these trucks aren't being led into Gaza from Israel's end because of silly things like there's been reports that if there is
No,
some
I'm not. I'm
a
talking about aid
fork or
that's
a
been.
knife
I'm
in the
talking about
truck.
aid that when it comes to like this nearly 1 million tons, I'm talking about aid that's been let in since the start of the war. It's something now approaching 50,000 trucks, and it's something now approaching 10,000 pallets of aid.
Okay, so
We
where
are talking.
where 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 do you draw these numbers from? That's more credible than Oxfam and UNRWA and the IPC.
Well, you're not suggesting a competitor number to the total number of aid, so you don't have anything else to go by.
I'm curious, like because you're questioning like the
No, no,
credibility
I'm
of the
not. I'm not.
reports that I'm
I'm not.
bringing
I'm not
up.
questioning. I'm not questioning the validity of the source. What I'm saying is that I'm questioning your inability to have a discussion about simple maths that we can work out. Like what we could do these calculations live. Like, we could work out the amount of aid getting into Gaza.
Right, but where
Uh,
are you drawing the numbers from that you want to calculate?
oh, in this case, it comes from the UN. It comes from OCA.
Yeah. Was
Like
that
the if OCA is the
I mean, I know what that is. I didn't know if you had like more you wanted to say.
no, just at the end, not particularly the aid number that I'm giving in terms of the total weight of all like the total weight
I
of aid
do
into Gaza in total is from OCA.
I do want to say we are at 21 minutes on our third round. We can like do
Okay, we
do
can move
another.
on.
I was saying we could do another if you want, or keep going, or I mean, I just didn't know what you want to do because technically we are at our third one and we went 10 minutes over. But I don't have a hard out, so if you wanted to keep going, we can, or like whatever you think.
I'm kind of hard out at one my time. So should we do closing statements? We'll cut this little. Sorry about that.
No. You're fine. Like I said, I don't have a hard out. I don't want to I didn't want to keep you over, like not realizing. Like I said, if you want to do another 10-minute period, I'm free to do that, or we can go to closings if you're wanting to, like if you have more of a hard out or want to make sure that we're wrapping up on time.
Um, Yeah, no. Should we go to close both for my timings and for the sake of the for your attention, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, I'm fine with
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much more audiences would be interested to listen to comparing notes on
that.
Occam versus other agencies of the UN.
Right. Aqua versus Oxfam, the real debate, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, so then you said you wanted me to go first, and you'll go on closing.
Maybe that's how this. Maybe that's how you should advertise this. It should be Oxfam versus Occam.
There we go, right?
Yeah.
Heated Oxfam versus Aqua debate. UNRWA versus the UN. Okay, so
Occam destroyed.
right, right, exactly. So we've been discussing whether genocide has happened in Gaza, whether Israel's actions constitute genocide. Kind of just to summarize my position, I think that understanding what genocide is important when talking about it. I think conflating it to there has to be a level of numbers reached is wrong. I think conflating it to things like the Holocaust are wrong. Not saying my opponent did that. I think people with less knowledge often tend to do that. And that's why I think my biggest point in coming into this was expressing how a lot of it has to do with intent. I mean, the sole purpose of genocide is about intent. Raphael Lemkin, the person who coined the term, who worked on the Genocide Convention, his specific point was that what differentiates genocide from war crimes is intent, right? That mixed with evidence of cultural destruction, mixed with 2% of the population being killed, with the destruction of hospitals, these kinds of things, I think shows the motive and the true intent of Israel to the best of their ability, erase or eradicate Palestinian culture, to destroy the group to the best that they can, whether it be culturally or physically. And I think that in the world we live in, obviously, another Holocaust isn't going to happen. So I don't think when we're talking about what genocide would look like nowadays, I don't think it would ever be mostly physical. I think you would have to do it kind of like through these kind of cultural avenues, which I believe that Israel has constituted. Again, I just want to list some of the cultural destruction. There's been over $300 million of damage to their cultural heritage. I'm going to butcher some of the names, but things like the Al Qarara Cultural Museum, the Akkad Museum of Culture, the Rafa Museum, which is cultural, the ancient port of Anthedon, Syed Al Hashim Mosque, which is one of the oldest in Gaza, has been destroyed. Also, the oldest church in Gaza has been destroyed. There's been Bronze Age settlements, Iron Age fortified sites, archaeological sites, the Rashad Shawa Cultural Center, multiple libraries, central archives, 16 cemeteries have all been destroyed. And another side note to add, because one of the things you commonly do here when you bring up this kind of destruction is a lot of people will say that Israel is doing so to attack Hamas. I think it's important to remember, though, all the times that Israel has launched these attacks, said they were doing so to target Hamas, and then reporting has came out that Hamas wasn't there. Like with the Al Shifa hospital, that's one of the more notable ones. Israel said they bombed it because it was a Hamas headquarters. Israeli investigation after the fact showed that there was no evidence of it ever being a Hamas headquarters. The same with the school that was recently bombed. I don't remember the name of the school, but Israel bombed it, said they were targeting Hamas, actually released 19 names of people in Hamas that supposedly they had killed in the bombing. And then it came out that most of the names of the 19 were people that were killed on different days in different attacks. So I think it's important to remember that Israel is purposefully attacking these cultural places for one reason or another. A lot of the times their justification for doing so doesn't hold up. And the 1954 Hague Convention defines cultural property in ways that align with the things that Israel is attacking, which again, the ICC has also added into their guidelines of intent when talking about evidence of genocide, specifically destruction of cultural property and cultural heritage. This kind of cultural genocide is evidence that a physical genocide could be happening as well. And I believe that clearly Israel is destroying cultural heritage. I don't think that's even disputable. And I think that mixed with their other actions constitutes what clearly would be defined as a genocide, especially when you look at some of the other examples of genocide, right? Like the East Timor genocide, where 2,000 were killed in the first couple of days. I mean, the numbers in Gaza dwarf that, right? Around 50,000 to 100 were killed total, but mostly they were destroying crops. They were detaining Timorese without charge. There's Palestinians getting detained without charge. Reports have shown as much as 3,000 Palestinians are being held without charge at this moment. They're torturing prisoners in East Timor. They're torturing prisoners in Palestine. If you look at the Bosnian genocide, which was only about 8,000 killed, there were executions without charge. There's executions without charge for Palestinian prisoners. There was large PTSD running rampant afterwards from the Bosnian genocide. There's large PTSD running rampant in Gaza afterwards as well. So I think that the parallels also give kind of this historical precedence, or at least a legal precedence to show as how Israel's actions are constituting genocide. I'll wrap my close with that. I do want to add, I appreciate you having the conversation with me very much so, and you can go ahead and close yourself.
I'd like to close by saying it still appears notable for me that the US government finds no interest in or finds no evidence of an unfolding genocide in Gaza, and not the political branch, but instead the Pentagon. What we're discussing in this case, in the argument that you're making, is that there is significant cultural damage to Gaza that's necessary to prove. Isn't that Israel has previously, you seem to ascribe this, previously thought that there was a military target that they were attacking that turned out to not be a military target. Again, even in that case, we're not necessarily talking about war crime, we're talking about a reasonable officer test, as I mentioned. But when it comes to the establishment of genocide, what we're discussing is your claim that it's an attempt to destroy a group for the purposes of the destruction of a large portion of their culture. The standard to which you seem to be holding Israel is a standard which, by the way, is not customary international law. The Hague Resolution in 1954 is not something that the US, the UK, nor Iceland, as NATO members, are party to. It's a weak claim for genocide. What's necessary to establish is not just that 40,000 people have died. As you said, it's intent. I prefer you when you say it's intent and when you say it's numbers, because you're more accurate now. But the necessary thing to establish when it comes to genocide is instead that the killing of a group, the destruction of a group, the murder of the people inside the group was directly caused by a desire, in this case, to destroy the culture of the group. This is the burden. It is not the burden to say that they desired to destroy the group and separately they killed members of this group. In order to reach genocide, in order to reach a decision in favor of genocide, we must establish a clear line from the cause to the effect. And this is the burden that in this hour I don't think has been met. But I would like to thank you very much for hosting me. And I hope that I don't come across as rude during this conversation.